Thank you for coming this afternoon. We have a very interesting talk planned for today, and we're going to get started. I know more people will come in as we start, but I think you all arrived on time, so we will honor that. I have the great pleasure of introducing Roy Wetzel, who is one of our residents here, and he was the leader of the NBC News election and polling unit in the 1970s and 80s. And today, he's going to tell you how he got there. Please welcome Roy.
Thank you, Becky. It's true. I did end up in New York doing a strange job, and I'll talk a little bit today about how that happened.
We need to adjust the sound just a little bit. Lots of people cannot hear you, so you can either get closer to the microphone or we could turn it up.
Well, I can't get much closer.
Is that better? Okay, we're going to turn it up just a little bit. Yeah.
I am going to give you a quick tour of my early years and point out along the way a few happenstances and odd twists of fate and peculiar coincidences that may have had something to do with how I ended up. And in the keeping with the theme of these meetings, insights, I will tell you maybe a little bit more about my actual life than you would otherwise hear under those circumstances. I was born in Detroit during the first term of President Franklin Roosevelt. Grew up in the city during the war, and then not too long after the war we moved to a suburb, a tiny little place called Pleasant Ridge, which had a total number of citizens of about 3,000 people. It was along the North Woodward corridor. It straddled Woodward Avenue from 9.5 Mile Road to 10 Mile Road, which gives you some idea of how small it was, just north of Ferndale, which was the suburb that was directly north of the city of Detroit along the Woodward Avenue corridor. And the place was so small, Pleasant Ridge, that it had no schools of its own, so it was part of the Ferndale School District. By the time we moved to the suburbs, of course, President Roosevelt had died and been succeeded by President Truman, his vice president. So in the fullness of time, I did go to the Ferndale High School. I wasn't quite ready for it when we moved to the suburbs, so I spent a couple of years at a boarding school, living in a boarding school a little further north along Woodward Avenue in a place called Bloomfield Hills. But I did go to Ferndale High School, and I arrived there just as President Truman was about to be elected in his own right to his own term in what was considered to be a considerable upset. And one of the main reasons it was considered to be an upset when he was elected was because everybody knew that New York Governor Tom Dewey was going to win that election. And included among the people who knew were the pollsters. There weren't many in the way of pollsters then, just Gallup and Roper. But they were so sure that Governor Dewey was going to win the presidency that they stopped polling in early October. And they learned something from that experience. Don't stop polling in early October. A mistake which pollsters never made again. They made other mistakes, but they never made that mistake again. My entire high school 4 years was encompassed within the Truman then administration. But a couple of things did happen during my high school that may have had something to do with what happened later. First of all, reel-to-reel audio tape recorders came on the market, became quite common. They became consumer electronics. And I got a hold of a couple of those and taught myself how to edit audio tape, a skill, such as it may be, that came in handy later. Another thing that happened is that during the summer between my sophomore and junior years in high school, my mother took me on a trip to New York City. And we stayed in a nice hotel, and where they brought you a newspaper every morning to your room, and the newspaper they brought you was the New York Times. Well, I was struck by the New York Times. In those days, you know, the Times printed transcripts of just about everything. Transcripts of speeches, transcripts of news conferences, transcripts of congressional hearings, transcripts of the Security Council of the United Nations, which was then in session because that was the summer of the Korean War, which began on the 25th of June, 1950. And I was so taken by the Times that as soon as we got back to Michigan, I got myself a subscription to the Times through the mail. Came a couple of days late, and of course was the Bulldog edition, but still had that subscription, and I kept that subscription one way or another, wherever I was, whatever I was doing, for the following 73 years. And that probably did have something to do with how my life turned out. Those two things happened in high school, and in the fullness of time, after 4 years, I graduated from high school. Because I was a tiny bit precocious, I did that when I was 16 years old. And then I moved on to college. The college I moved on to was Hillsdale College, which is just down the road here, 70, 80 miles on the way to Chicago. I ought to stop and come into the present for a moment, because some of you may be aware of Hillsdale College in its present form. It has become something of an outpost for conservative national American politics. But the Hillsdale College that I went to was nothing like that at all. When I arrived at Hillsdale College, it was just as President-to-be Eisenhower was being elected to his first term. And there was nary a trace of national politics in the air at Hillsdale. A nice little coeducational liberal arts college in a quiet little community in the southern tier of Michigan. The college had at that time fewer than 700 students. It had a reasonably good reputation academically. And also on the campus at that time, there were 3 of the national sororities had chapters, the Chios, the Kappas, and the Pi Phis, and 3 of the national fraternities had chapters there, the ATOs, the Delts, and the Delt Sigs. I joined one of the fraternities, the ATO, and in the spring of that first year, a fraternity brother and I decided we would build a radio studio on the campus of Hillsdale College, and we did. There was a very old classroom building right at the center of the campus. It had a what I call a half basement, meaning the basement was half underground and half above ground. And that basement was the focus of our attention. There were a number of rooms in the basement of this old classroom building, which was still in use as a classroom building, though very elderly. One of the rooms was used by the people who put out the annual yearbook, another by the people who put out the college newspaper. And there was a small classroom there, but there were also a couple of empty rooms, small rooms, but one of which was about 9 feet square, I would guess. And adjacent to it, there was an oblong room that was about the same width, a little bit longer. Those were the two rooms that we had our eye on. One might say surreptitiously, but I think maybe more politely, we'd just say unofficially. And we did, in fact, turn them into a broadcast studio. And when I say we turned them into a recording studio, we went down to the local hardware store, got quite a lot of those panels that you can put up on the wall to soften the sound in a room, and quite a few of the cans of the guck you used to stick them on walls. And we did the walls and the ceilings of those two rooms. And we rather grandiloquently called the small room our control room and the larger room our studio. But there's another important piece to that story, and that is that an alum of the college owned and operated a real radio station in Coldwater, Michigan, which was about a half-hour drive further to the west toward Chicago. And we went and chatted with him, and he told us if we would produce some 15-minute tape-recorded programs about life at Hillsdale, he would broadcast them. So we did, and he did. That was about where things stood at the end of our first year. We went away for the summer and came back in the fall and got a little bit more serious about it when we came back in the fall. We recruited a few more students to take part in the activity. As I recall, one Chi O, one Kappa, one Pi Phi, and a couple of more guys from our house. So we had a little more staff. And the guy from Coldwater, who owned the radio station, came over that fall, climbed up to the attic of that building, took a look west. There was really nothing between Hillsdale and his station out on the highway south of Coldwater, but farmland. He saw he had a clear line of sight, so he installed a special radio transmitter, specialized radio transmitter, in the attic of the building. And so that made things a lot easier for us, because in the previous year when we had made our tape programs, we'd had to drive them over to Coldwater, the tapes. There was no other way to get them there. That's how I know it was a half-hour drive from Hillsdale to Coldwater. My fraternity brother had an old jalopy of a station wagon, and we took the tapes over there every week. But he, seeing that he had a clear line of sight to Coldwater, he installed a transmitter up there in the attic, a special transmitter, and we could use that. I got a FCC license so I could operate the thing, and we could now transmit our tapes directly to Coldwater without having to make that drive. That was definitely an improvement. And by that time we were to the point of doing 5 programs a week, 5 little 15-minute programs a week, which I would edit using the skill of editing videotapes that I had earlier acquired. And I won't tell you much about those programs. They were of a great variety about things that were going on in the Hillsdale campus, but there is one set of them that I particularly liked. We got each of the sororities to stage a song fest of their sorority songs at their house. We took our tape recorder over there and recorded them, and I turned those into 15-minute edited each of those into a 15-minute program. The tape recorders, by the way, that we were using were tape recorders that belonged to me, that the same tape recorders I'd had in high school when I had moved on to the college. I took them with me on a couple of microphones. And of course, whenever any visitors of any note came to visit the college, we shanghaied them for an interview and turned them into a program. But the 4 years of my time at Hillsdale was interrupted at the end of the second year in the summer. My 18th birthday came along at that point, and so it was time for me to deal with the military. I had a weird notion that I wanted to be a pilot, so I tried to enlist in the Air Force, but that came to nothing because at that time I was 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed 112 pounds. And the Air Force had a minimum weight and for a person my height, it was about 20 pounds heavier than I was. The recruiters actually were very helpful. They tried to coach me into how to gain a bunch of weight, but my metabolism was having no part of that. And so I went in the Army. And in the Army, I did the things you do in the Army for a while. Nothing happened in the Army that would point toward the direction of my future in broadcasting. But one thing did happen while I was in the Army that was of some significance to my life. I contracted polio. And I spent a couple of months in the base hospital at Fort Hood, Texas, where I got really a lot of physical therapy, which went on for months and months. But I was also very lucky because although the disease affected the left side of my body, rather weakening it, something that actually continued for the rest of my life. I would have a weaker left side of my body than the right. I was very lucky that I had no real paralysis. When the time in the hospital was finished, they gave me a month's convalescent leave, came back here to Michigan, and came out here to Ann Arbor to visit yet another fraternity brother who by that time was in the law school here. And during the 2-3 days that I was visiting him, I also went over and talked to the folks in the admissions office and started the process of transferring here as a junior, which I did. In the fall, when President Eisenhower was seeking his re-election to his second term, I went into the journalism department, and I suppose that certainly had something to do with what happened later. But there was something more important going on at the university at that time. The university was operating a television studio in a building over on Maynard Street, for any of you who are familiar with the Central Campus. That building is still there, and for many decades now it's been a sports bar, but in those days it was a television studio, not a television station, but a television studio. What the university was doing there was producing half-hour television programs on film called kinescopes that were distributed around the state to the commercial television stations for them to broadcast to meet their educational commitment to the Federal Communications Commission. There were no public television stations at that point. They were a later development, so only the commercial stations were there. There was also in Ann Arbor at that time a UHF television station broadcasting. Very few people at that time had television sets that were capable of receiving UHF, so the station was mostly broadcasting just out into the air. And the university had made an arrangement with that station that they would broadcast some programs, a few programs on that station. The television operation was not a student volunteer operation of any kind. It was a fully commercial operation, and everyone there was a paid employee. I got myself a job there, hired initially as an announcer, and in addition to the half-hour programs that the university was producing for distribution to the stations around the state, they were also broadcasting on that UHF television station a children's program in the afternoon. So one of my early assignments as an announcer was to take the role of Reggie Raccoon. Reggie was a hand puppet that lived in a knot in a tree, which was a cardboard set off in a corner of the big studio. And immediately adjacent to it, there was a very large papier-mâché butterfly. Had to be larger than any butterfly you've ever seen, because otherwise the camera wouldn't have been able to see it. And that butterfly was manned by a woman student, also a member of the staff, who took the role of Felicia Butterfly. And she and I introduced the children's programs by having a conversation which was scripted for us by the producer of the children's programs. We talked for a minute or two at the beginning of the program, Reggie and Felicia. And needless to say, I do not at this point remember a single word of any of that dialogue, but it was about what you would expect a raccoon and a butterfly to say to each other. So we got the programs on the air. During the 2 years that I worked at that station, we did something else that I would like to tell you about that is perhaps a little bit more directly related to where I ended up. We produced a documentary, a half-hour documentary, on the Jackson prison, Jackson State Prison, which is down the road away in Jackson. At that time, the Jackson Penitentiary was the largest walled prison in the United States. It covered 60 acres, and every square inch of those 60 acres was surrounded by 34 feet high stone walls. The prison officials were actually very cooperative with us. They let us come in and film this and that, the usual stuff, the interview with the warden and some of the guards. And they even let me, as a reporter, go into the cells of 2 or 3 of the nonviolent prisoners and film interviews with them. They all told me they were innocent and had been improperly convicted, but they also told me about their life a little bit in the jail. There were 5,000 prisoners in that penitentiary at that time. And one of the things that I remember most about that was the kitchen where they prepared the food for those 5,000 people. The kitchen was the size of a very, very, very large I suppose you might say a sports room, a gymnasium. And what I remember really most was that they had these gigantic vats where they prepared the food for in that gymnasium-sized kitchen for those prisoners. We spent our time there, came back, put the film together. I supervised the editing of the film, and I wrote the narration. And we actually broadcast that program live one evening on that UHF television station. So I read the narration voiceover film live. A copy of that documentary still exists about a mile from here, over on the north campus of the university in the Bentley Historical Library, along with a few other programs of the university from that period. That was my first television documentary. After 4 years, college, the 2 years in Hillsdale and the 2 years here combined. I did, in fact, graduate, and got a job at a station in Rochester, New York. Probably, I think, the most interesting thing about that is that the fellow who hired me, the general manager of the station, had been a White House speechwriter during the first term of the Eisenhower administration and had worked on the Eisenhower re-election campaign, and then had abandoned government and politics and somehow gotten himself a job as the general manager of this station in Rochester, New York. But he hired me fresh out of college. He may have seen something in my background that appealed to him. His background certainly appealed to me. He was very anxious to do something with that station. He had been hired there not long before he hired me. At that time, Rochester was the home base of the Gannett newspaper chain. They had 2 newspapers there, an AM and a PM, and their corporate headquarters. And up until that time, the local politics in that community had been pretty much left to those 2 newspapers. Well, Bob, the guy who hired me, wanted to change that, and so we did. We introduced very intense local political and election coverage, and even spread our wings to cover the local legislators when they went off to Albany for the very brief state sessions of the state legislature. The state legislature at that point was only in session for about 3 months at the beginning of the year. But at least it gave me an excuse to spend some time in Albany and find out what was going on there. And while all of this was going on, because I stayed in Rochester for more than 5 years, the Eisenhower administration ended. The 1960 election was held. John Kennedy was elected. 3 years later, he was assassinated and succeeded by his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. And the governor of New York at that time was Nelson Rockefeller, who had been elected in 1958, re-elected in 62. In 1964, which was of course going to be a presidential election year, Governor Rockefeller decided to take a run at the Republican presidential nomination. And that gave me a chance to join a presidential candidate entourage, press entourage, as we went into New Hampshire for a 3 or 4 day campaign trip of his. And I can tell you 3 things about that. 1, it was very cold in New Hampshire that winter. And number 2, when you travel in the Rockefeller, or did travel in the Rockefeller press entourage, you traveled in style. And 3rd, he finished 3rd in the New Hampshire primary. His campaign actually hung on until the very end of the primary season in June in California, but the nomination went to Barry Goldwater, who was in turn defeated in a landslide by President Johnson in the '64 election. The next year, I decided I probably had enough of Rochester and done everything I was going to do there, and it was time to move on. So I got myself hired by the post-Newsweek broadcast operation in D.C., in Washington, D.C. I was hired actually as an investigative reporter and did in fact do one investigative report using a hidden camera inside a briefcase. Went and filmed some illegal slot machines that were being operated in clubs along a highway south of the district in Maryland. But something much more important happened while I was employed at the broadcast operation of Post Newsweek. The higher-ups, I guess, decided to turn me from being a reporter into being a manager. And it happened kind of slowly. They gave me, that operation, of course, was much, much, much bigger than the station in Rochester news operation. And they gave me progressively more complicated jobs as a manager. I think when it finally really dawned on me that what they were up to was when I found out that I was one of 8 or 9 people of the broadcast operation who was on the list to attend meetings when Mrs. Graham came to visit. That would be Catherine Graham, the owner and president of the Post Newsweek operation, whose base headquarters was downtown at the office of the Washington Post. But from time to time, periodically, she'd come out and visit the broadcasting operation, which was out in Northwest Washington. And while I was far and away the least important person in the room when those meetings took place, I was in the room. At the end of that rather tumultuous year, 1964, where there had been 2 assassinations, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and a bunch of other fairly interesting news. At the end of that year, I got myself hired by NBC News in Washington. And I started work at NBC News on exactly the same day that President Nixon started his work as President of the United States, which is to say Monday, January 20th, 1969. There was a very large ceremony for him downtown on the Capitol steps. No ceremony for me at all on my first day at NBC. I was surprised to discover that a man who had been hired a few months before I had been hired in New York by NBC News, and who had been hired with the idea that he would become president of NBC News. He'd been a pal of Jock Witzke's and had been the editor of the New York Herald Tribune. So he needed to find out a fair amount about how a television and radio news operation ran. So he set out on a tour of all of the bureaus and locations where NBC News operated around the country and around the world. He came to the Washington Bureau and talked to a bunch of people. We had one-on-one conversations with a number of them. The big surprise for me was that I was one of those people whom he decided to have a conversation with. I rather liked him, and apparently he thought well of me because I discovered that I was on a little bit of a fast track. Before the end of that first year, I was out of the Washington Bureau, promoted to the Chicago Bureau. NBC News had a very large operation in Chicago, still does. And I was promoted to a deputy bureau chief. There were 2 of us there in Chicago. My primary responsibility actually in Chicago was to look after the radio news operation of the network there. That I only stayed there for a couple of years, and I was promoted again and moved to Cleveland as the bureau chief. Cleveland, of course, was a much smaller place, but from an NBC News place, I only had 2 network correspondents and film crews there, but there also was in Cleveland an NBC News operated television station, and it ended up that most of my time and energy really went to being news director of that station. I could tell you some more stories, but we don't have time for that here today. Because I only stayed there for 2 years, and then was moved to New York and told by the now president of NBC News, the fellow I mentioned before, having been hired and with whom I'd had the conversation, And I was told directly by him that I was being moved there with the idea that I would become head of the election unit. But I was to spend a year, the first year, observing the operation of the election unit. Well, we moved there at the end of 1973, just as the Nixon administration, he'd been reelected in a landslide in 1972 while I was in Cleveland. But by the fall of 1973, the Nixon administration was quite publicly disintegrating. So it turned out that year 1974, which was to be my kind of quiet observation year, turned into a year of quite a few 7-day work weeks. The approximate reason for that was that normally on an election night in an off year, when the broadcast consists of coverage of the Senate races, a third of the Senate is up every 2 years, as you know, and the governor's races, and there were always a bunch of governor's races. But the House of Representative elections were treated as a sort of a subsidiary of the guy who ran the Senate races, because as you undoubtedly know, very few of the 435 House races are ever seriously considered. They've been arranged primarily by gerrymandering, so that almost all of those districts belong to one party or the other forevermore. But there were a few districts that were at each year, maybe 40 of the 435 that were contested. But that year, it turned out that the House races were going to be much more important than that. They were being used as a sort of a symbol of the fallout of the Watergate scandal that was engulfing the Nixon administration. So 1974, which was to be my observation year, early in that year, I was given responsibility for the House races because the guy who was going to do the Senate just really couldn't handle them as a minor subsidiary of his job. So I got to work finding out which of the districts were going to be of interest, and getting the broadcast of the House districts ready for election night when it was clear that was going to be more important than it normally would have been. And as it turned out, the Republicans suffered in that election a net loss of 43 House seats, a very big loss for the Republicans. So it was worthwhile to have done that. 1975 turned out to be my quieter year, but there was a fellow by the name of Jimmy Carter from somewhere in the South, and he had decided to run for the Democratic presidential nomination, and had undertaken the very unusual procedure of going off to Iowa, where they held caucuses, and to do his early campaigning instead of doing what other candidates had always done prior to that time, which was start their campaigns with the New Hampshire primary. So I spent quite a bit of time myself out in the area around Des Moines in the fall of 1975, getting to know the party operatives of both parties and the leaders, and getting to watch the Carter campaign. But I sensed that this was going to be a story. No broadcast network had ever bothered to cover the Iowa caucuses up to that point. Caucuses had been there, but they had been left to the local media. But I sensed that there was going to be a real story there. So when the caucus night came along in January, I took a fairly large bunch of NBC News folks along with me out there, and we staffed up very heavily. We had a special broadcast at 11 o'clock on the television network at Eastern Time that night. And we, of course, had to deal with the Today program the next morning, and we had to deal with radio, which the NBC News radio network operated 24 hours a day with a 5-minute newscast every hour on the hour. So we needed a large staff. That was the first time that any broadcast network had paid any attention to the Iowa caucuses, and it turned out to be a bit of a success. I did not actually take over the operation of the election unit until the beginning of 1976. That year, as you may well not remember, was a rather close election between Jimmy Carter and President Gerald Ford, who had taken over when Nixon resigned in August of 1974. As a matter of fact, it was so close that it was not until 3:31 in the morning of the Wednesday after the election day that we were able to call the election for Carter. And oddly enough, the state that made it possible for us to do that was Mississippi, a southern state, just down the road from the state where he'd been governor. But we were now about 10 years past the time when the Voting Rights Act had been enacted during the Johnson administration in 1965, and it had begun to have its effect of changing the solid Democratic South into the solid Republican South. So it was that Mississippi was actually closely contested that night between the Republican and Democratic candidates. But at 3:31 in the morning, we cracked the nut and announced that Jimmy Carter would become the president. After that first year of running the election unit, including the off-year elections and the midway, I began to get ready for the 1980 presidential election, which, if you'll forgive my immodesty, I regard as sort of the big moment of my life, the 1980 elections. There was something kind of floating around in the air called what you now know as exit polls. They weren't really being much used, but they were there. They were primarily at that point an invention of the television networks in the United Kingdom. So in 1979, I spent quite a lot of time flying back and forth between New York and London, and palling up with the ITN network, which was not the network that the NBC normally partnered with. We normally partnered with the BBC, but ITN was the network that really knew about these new polls. And so I partnered up with them and studied their technique. There were a couple of elections in the United Kingdom that year that I was able to actually watch how they did it. And I quickly came to the conclusion that their methodology wasn't going to be ideal for us. They would pick maybe 12 constituencies in all of the United Kingdom and would go and poll there all day. They'd have a procedure, of course, for picking every fifth voter or every fourth voter, something of that kind, but they'd end up with more than 300 voters in each of their election places, each constituency. But there were only 12 of them, and they were clustered. And didn't seem to me that was going to work very well. So when I came back, one of the first people whom I hired was a statistician from Princeton. He was the first graduate student of a man by the name of John Tukey, who was the guy who ran the Bell Laboratory in Princeton, but also was on the faculty of Princeton. And his first graduate student, Dr. Richard Link, quickly persuaded me that among all the things that statisticians know how to do with numbers, the one thing they really knew how to do well was to draw a sample, a random sample. And so I decided we'd be much better off if we, instead of having 12 locations, if we had 1,000 locations. So we picked 1,000 precincts randomly around the United States and did our polling there. And we had existing, which I had inherited at the election unit, a computer model that worked on analyzing the raw vote, the county by county vote in all of the states. And we also had a model that analyzed the key precincts that we collected from all around the country. But I added to that a third projection model that involved the election day voter polling. And that, by the way, is what we always called them at NBC. We never called them exit polls. And when I was asked, which I was very frequently, both inside and outside NBC, why we insisted on calling them election day voter polls and not exit polls, I always gave the same answer, and that was that we did not poll exits, we polled voters. So the incorporation of that model into our projections made it possible for us to project the election of Ronald Reagan at 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. That was about 2 hours before either ABC or CBS was able to catch up with us. That accomplishment had a fairly beneficial effect on my contract negotiations the next spring when my contract was renewed. But it also stirred up a bit of a hornet's nest among some of the members of the House of Representatives from the West Coast who were determined that we had destroyed the elections on the West Coast, and that they were telling stories that once voters out in the West, where it was 5:15 p.m. when we made our projection, had just given up on the election and gone home and nobody had voted. Fortunately, we were able to prove that conclusively to be untrue. And that was because the county clerk of Los Angeles County had for many, many years, for reasons of his own, had a set of precincts that he had selected in Los Angeles County, where from time to time during the course of the day, he had them report to him how many people had voted. Well, he had done that year, as he had done in many years before, and he was able to show us the data that exactly the same number of people had turned out to vote in every one of those precincts as had voted previously. There had been no panic of voters. They had not gone home. They had stayed and voted. And so I don't want to argue that case here with you anymore. I've probably told you already a little more than I should about it. But so that was my big moment. And of course, that meant that Reagan became president. Reagan was president during the following 8 years that I remained in the election unit. My last election was the 1988 election, where the then Vice President George H.W. Bush, the elder Bush, was elected president. And after we got that taken care of, I retired, and have been retired ever since. So that's sort of the what I have to tell you. If any of you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them.